I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. American Individualism. How a new generation of conservatives can save the Republican Party. Margaret Hoover is the author, and she joins me in studio. John Avlon of CNN and the Daily Beast, who will be stepping out of this because this is a relative of Margaret Hoover. He's cheering on his wife. David Drucker of Roll Call is with me in Washington. We're listening to the battle cry of freedom, which, of course, is completely wed to the Republican Party once upon a time, but that was then, Margaret. And Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan are men of the 19th and 20th century, and here we're in their 21st century. Your subtitle is How a New Generation of Conservatives Can Save the Republican Party. You're talking about the millennials. How so, Margaret? Are the millennials open to suggestion? Are they ready to look at the Republican Party again, or have they turned away?
Well, they certainly turned away in 2008. The millennials are the generation, they were born at the beginning of the Reagan presidency and the end of the Clinton presidency. They are the largest generation in American history. There are 80 million of them. There are 17 million more millennials than baby boomers, read seniors. There are 27 million more than Gen X. They turned out 50 million were eligible to vote in 2008, and half of them turned out to the polls. They were 18% of the electorate. We expect them to be 24% of the electorate, almost a quarter in 2012. The catch is that they didn't vote Republican last time, and they didn't vote Republican the time before. And what we know about partisan identity is that it solidifies after 3 presidential election cycles. So this is not an overstatement about the state of the Republican Party with the younger generation. If we don't make inroads with this Gen X generation in the next 16 months, we could lose them to Democratic and independent voter rolls for the rest of their lives.
Since I am one of the boomers who's fading, I'm
going to
turn this over to a Gen Xer, David Drucker. David, the millennials, they're looking for a direction, and that is a good question for either party.
That is, and I thought Generation X used to be young, and now I realize I'm right behind the baby boomers. But Margaret, two things. One, if an economy for a good number of years does not perform well and it affects the livelihood of a generation, how does that play into their political allegiances? And the other question, and it's sort of a devil's advocate question in terms of the premise of your book, is that there were a generation of liberals, and in a sense old school liberals, but still very liberals, that came out of the 60s and the 70s that in 1980 voted Republican because they voted for Ronald Reagan, and we famously remember them as Reagan Democrats, who probably kept voting Republican at least up until 1992. And I want to know how that squares with the premise that you get fixed at a certain point and you are lost to the other party from that time forward.
Well, so I'll take your second one first. The economy actually is quite relevant because that had everything to do with, much to do with the Republican Revolution in the first place. So the millennials are 37% unemployed or underemployed, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. So they're the most unemployed generation in 3 decades. So there's no way that this can't affect them and affect their sensibilities in terms of how they look at government. I think the thing that's relevant to the millennials and that characterizes their generation most is that they are pragmatic, not ideological. They largely, it's also true that generations tend to vote. They tend to reject the failures in government that they know. And I think it's just as true that a generation of Republicans came to the Reagan Revolution, not only because of a vision that Reagan articulated, but also because of the failures of the Carter administration. The same is certainly true for the Republican brand damage in the 2000 years and the embracing of the sort of vision of Barack Obama. But generational specialists tend to say that political sensibilities once cast don't tend to change easily. So there may have been a shift of this frankly, the Reagan Revolution, what you characterize as liberal or as the Reagan Democrats. What you're talking about is a shift over 12 years. So that isn't fickle. That is pretty consistent in terms of how they voted over time.
Margaret, the book is American Individualism. Your great-grandfather, Herbert Hoover, when he was Secretary of Commerce, wrote an essay called American Individualism. At that time, he was, as were many of the men in government, very much threatened by other forms of government that were in competition. Syndicalism, communism, capitalism, and fascism. And what he asserted is that there is a way to, by your own bootstraps in America, to assert what's good for you and what's good for the country. Does that connect with your generation, American individualism today? Does that connect to people who are more tolerant, more curious, more globally educated than their fathers and grandfathers?
Well, I appreciate you bringing up the reference to my great-grandfather, which is the title. And it's true. One of the cases I try to make is that Herbert Hoover was a millennial spirit 80 years before the millennials came about. He was a technologist. He was a globalist. He was concerned. One of the things that characterizes millennials is that they are very concerned about being part of something that's larger than themselves. They care about community service. They care about connecting to something that's larger than them. And Herbert Hoover, of course, was a great humanitarian and had a large legacy of service. I think with American individualism, Hoover articulated in a speech that was called Rugged Individualism in 1928, a pathway forward, which he saw was the bifurcation of two directions that America could go, a choice of two futures, if you will. And he said that the that we're at a crossroads where America could choose to go in the direction of American individualism, freedom, and individual liberty, or we could go in the direction of Europe, of paternalism, of state socialism, of over-bureaucratization, with the kind of overregulation that saps individual initiative. And this is a riff that we're hearing today in our debates. I think we can certainly make the case to millennials as long as we make a pragmatic case in our politics. We don't demonize Barack Obama because they still like Barack Obama. 50%, 55% of them favor Barack Obama still. They like him personally.
They voted 2-1 for Barack Obama.
They voted 2-1 for him, although his favorability has dropped by double digits. So I do think there is an opening for Republicans if we make a pragmatic case for an alternative set of policies, a pro-growth economic agenda, for example. And if we make the case in this fiscal debate that this is generational theft, every dollar that the government spends today, the millennials are going to have to pay back themselves, either in higher taxes or larger government or a worse economy or all of it.
That's right. David, Margaret makes an inarguable point that the millennials are going to have to pay for the recklessness of the boomers, that's my lot, and the inability of you, David, the Gen Xers, to bring us to bear.
Complete failure on my part.
Yes.
So I apologize.
In fact,
but look, Barack Obama also promised he would take on these issues. An entire generation elected, they elected him with this rhetoric. So I think that Republicans have a case to make.
They have a case to make. Margaret's book makes it. American Individualism. Margaret Hoover is the author. How a new generation of conservatives can save the Republican Party and save the Republic from its own unwise spending. I'm John Batchelor.